Welcome to the Capstone Conversation, where you learn about what's happening in the greater East Bay. I am your host, Jared Asch. Today, I am joined by an engineer, Jim Levine, with the Montezuma Wetlands Project. This is an interesting idea happening here on parts of the Delta and in the Bay Area. Jim, I'd love for you to tell us in your words, what is the project and what is happening there?
Yes, I'd be happy to. We have pioneered the idea of using dredge from the Bay Area's tip channels and ports and harbors to fill subsided areas and create really valuable habitat for fish and wildlife. And I had the idea literally staring out the window, noticing that the bay shoreline in Emeryville, with its reasonably steep slopes and riprap cover, didn't seem to host many birds or wildlife. And then I realized that maybe there's an opportunity to repurpose sediment that they didn't know what to do with. And that's what we ended up doing. And we're now 20 years into our operations.
There has been major impacts to environmental preservation, to the animal population, to the waterways. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, really since the late 1800s, when a lot of the natural tidal wetlands were diked off. The pioneers built levees around them with the goal of using the land for agriculture or grazing. And they, in fact, did that to the entirety of the Suisun Marsh, the Sacramento Delta, and the site we eventually acquired from the Santa Fe Southern Pacific Railroad system, the Montezuma site that we now own. When you dike off those lands, all those areas I mentioned are underlain by tens of feet thicknesses of peat. Over the course of many decades, those sites will subside. And in fact, before they were diked, the area around our site and the Suisun Marsh, which is at the confluence of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers, where those rivers meet the salty water of the bay. And that was the most vital habitat for young fish, the salmon and smelt that would come down from the river systems. And particularly in the case of salmon, the small salmon really benefited from the small tidal channels where they could feed and nurse and hide from predators and grow big and strong enough to survive in the ocean. Those tidal wetlands were a key in the life cycle of the salmon, the California's iconic fish. In addition to the diversion of flows due to the dams and water use for farms and people, the loss of that key habitat was a major factor in the decline of fish populations. When a federal judge in 1989 shut down the aquatic disposal of dredged sediments, I was sitting in my office looking out the window and thought maybe I could repurpose those sediments to raise up those subsided land. And we ended up focusing on what we thought could be the most valuable recreated habitat in the entire region. And that was the western half of the Montezuma site, which the railroad owned, which is about 1,800 acres. And so that's the site that we did the project on.
I thought that was just worth diving into because there was so much there versus a short explanation. I want to now take a minute and ask, who is Jim? Tell us about your background. Where'd you go to school? Where are you from? What's your professional background? How'd you end up here?
I was raised in New York. My parents were second generation Americans, and they moved to Englewood, New Jersey when I was 2 years old, which is just across the George Washington Bridge, and an incredible place to grow up. Englewood was a little bit of a microcosm of the country. The town had people from every socioeconomic background. They had houses that looked as big as the White House, and then they had houses, small houses, where the people in those houses worked at the other houses and were very working class people. But most of us went to the public schools. And so it was a great melting pot. And they had fantastic public schools and a very unique student population. And so I went through public school there, went to high school there, ran cross country and played basketball for the high school, and then ended up going to Brandeis University outside of Boston as a freshman, where I played college basketball my freshman year. And it just turned out that that fall seemed like the coldest winter on record. And the winds coming off of the Boston harbor, even 10 miles inland, made me want to do something else. So I applied to one California college as a transfer sophomore and got into UC Berkeley. December of 1973, I packed up my belongings and caught an airplane and arrived at SFO in late December of 1973. I was studying political science at the time. I didn't really like the political science program at UC Berkeley. And so I dropped out of school for a year. I started a little landscaping business and was able to support myself. I took trips to the Caribbean and hitchhiked around the country and just trying to figure out what I was going to do. And then I realized that I really was an environmentalist at heart. I was a tree hugger. I wanted to save the environment, and I thought that given my educational background, I did really well in school and in the standardized testing, math and science and all that. And I thought, well, let me go back to school and try to make a difference. I enrolled back at UC Berkeley, and when you re-enroll, I had to start as a UC Extension student. But at that time, they allowed you to sit in on any class that any enrolled student could sit in on. The first day I went back, it was a class taught by world-class hydrologist Luna Leopold, one of the top hydrologists in the world, which is the kind of experience you can get at UC Berkeley. The first day of his first class, he described how, and showed pictures. This was slides. It was way before PowerPoint. Slides of him standing with the president of Egypt, looking at how the Aswan Dam could be better managed. And him standing with the Prime Minister of India in front of the Taj Mahal, looking at how we could use Western ideas to modernize their water system. Then a slide of him spending 3 weeks on the Colorado River, looking at how major storms changed the shape of the river, where minor storms did not. I went up to him after class and I said, "Oh my God, I want to have a job like you." I showed up at his office, and after ignoring me for literally hours, he let me in and he asked to see. I told him I wanted a job like you, and he asked to see my registration card. And back then at UC Berkeley, they were actual cards. It was a little 3x5 card, which you had your classes on. And he went down the list and he literally crossed out every course I had signed up for except for his. And he counseled me. He said, if you really want to have some impact, you better take advanced differential equations. You better take organic chemistry for chemists. You better take all the fundamentals. So you understand the science better than anyone. And then maybe you could have a job like I have. That first day of class coming back changed my life. And back then, you were able to switch classes during the first week easily. And so, I put together what ended up being a 6-year undergraduate program. I still worked on the weekends, digging holes and planting plants. I was under no pressure to finish college, and then finished my undergraduate degree, which was in the College of Natural Resources with a focus on chemistry and environmental sciences and hydrology. Then I was admitted to the graduate engineering program and then got a master's in civil engineering at Cal. During my last quarter of graduate school, the California Water Quality Control Board chief engineer heard about me and reached out and hired me as his selected student intern from UC Berkeley. Every year he got to hire one intern from Stanford and one from Berkeley. He hired me all during graduate school. I worked part-time for the Water Quality Control Board. And then my last quarter of graduate school, they made me field engineer and environmental emergency incident commander. And literally that first day I went down to the motor pool, they set me up with a vehicle with flashing lights and state of California decals and e-license plates that allowed me to, drive at any speed necessary to get the job done. For 2.5 years, I was the on-scene decision maker and commander for all the chemical and oil spills in 4 Bay Area counties. And that was an experience that changed my life. Doing that kind of work where you had to actually come up with a solution that day was the antithesis of what environmental science, the protocols used in environmental science, where you do exhaustive studies and the studies recommend new studies and you maybe never get to an actual solution. Whereas my job was to get to a solution. We solved big problems, within 24 hours. I have 100 stories that I won't bore you with today about some of the things that we ended up doing. But that process is and that job and my experience as a state employee and an emergency commander, that process changed my life. And it made me who I am today. And I owe so much to the state and to Dr. Wu, who was the chief engineer who hired me. And I think about him today.
I like that story. It sounds like you found, fortunately, 2 good mentors that help make small changes that send ripples throughout your life and now throughout the region as a result of that. There's the devotion to creative solutions. And as you were talking about the 24-hour time window to make a decision, I was thinking of MacGyver because he used his physics and engineering backgrounds. And I mean, I know he's fictional, but he was solving a problem at that moment.
And that's what I had to do. And I had to usually come up with a solution or at least some interim steps within the hour and do risk analyses most of the time in my head because everybody wanted to take samples and test things. And we didn't have time for a lot of that. And often, these incidents, particularly on the highways, had traffic backed up and you couldn't drive samples anywhere. It taught me really at the age of 23 how to make risk management decisions with imperfect information. When I left the state, that technique and the ability to make decisions with imperfect information and move the ball, move the solutions while we were still studying parts of the problem is what gave me what I needed to start my own company when I was 28 years old.
I want to come back to the Montezuma Wetlands and talk a little bit more about this project. How is the project impacting the immediate waterways around you? What kind of environmental impact are you having? I know we talked a little bit about wildlife, but let's talk about just the water for a minute. How does this help water flow, water treatment, restoring native habitats? Talk a little bit through that.
The project really doesn't do much for water availability for cities or farms. The area where the site's located is brackish water. So that's water that's really not used for anything except it flows in and out of the few marshes that are left up there. What we did was we developed plans to initially raise 600 acres of the site, which is a square mile. It's a very large area.
Yeah.
600 acres of the site from 8 feet below sea level to 2 or 3 feet above sea level. We did all the permitting and the studies, which took us 12 years to finally get our final permit for this project. Then we had to finance the improvements we needed on site. It was about $20 million of improvements we needed to accept dredged material and to purchase the equipment and the pipelines we needed so we could offload those sediment barges quickly enough to be cost effective and cost comparative to how the Army Corps handled sediment at that time. Over the course of the next 18 years or so, up until 2023, I guess that's 20 years, we were able to fill that phase one 600-acre area with 9 million cubic yards of dredge sediment. And we successfully raised the elevations up. We created ponds so that we had left a channel design in that phase one area. And then in October 2020, we breached the Montezuma Slough levee, and millions of gallons of brackish tidal water entered the site. And since that time in 2020, we have had the site, that portion of the site, which is about 550 acres that are subject to tidal flow. That site has been receiving tides twice a day. And the ecological results of that of raising the site and breaching the levee and reestablishing tidal flow into that site, the ecological results have been magnificent, beyond what anybody ever thought was possible. We have had native vegetation and some non-native vegetation come back. So the site looks like a marsh now, and it functions like a marsh. We've had endangered species, birds and salt marsh harvest mice come back into the site in droves. And the recovery of those species on this project has just been incredible. That first 550 acres is now a functioning, high value, critical tidal habitat. In fact, 2 months ago, we detected our first wild salmon, young salmon, swimming in the tidal channel. The dream I had, we could somehow move the needle just by taking the initiative and then doing, 12 years of incredibly hard work and frustrating work at times, that we could actually move the needle and help restore the salmon to California is actually happening.
That's great. One of the big elements of this project is collecting the sediment that's dredged up elsewhere throughout the Bay Area. What would happen if you weren't collecting it? What would happen to that sediment otherwise?
When we first started this project, and we were the second project in the region to use sediment this way. The Corps of Engineers had a pilot project called Sonoma Baylands just off Highway 37. And they used, I think, 2 million yards to restore that site. Other than that site, which was filled up by the time we entered the scene, all the sediment was being dumped in the bay or the ocean, where it does have deleterious effects. Our project allowed that material to be diverted to have a positive effect. Now there are two other projects that came online like ours. Cullinan Ranch on the Napa River, near the mouth of the Napa River, which is run by Ducks Unlimited. And I think they've taken about 5 million cubic yards, and they're about full now. That won't be available after the year, I believe. And then Hamilton Airfield, that restoration took about 5 or 6 million cubic yards, and that's been filled. At this time, once Cullinan is done, other than our site, the rest of the material is going to primarily go to aquatic disposal, both in the bay and the ocean. Now, there's another site, an expansion of Hamilton that is being discussed called Bell Marine Keys, but it's very expensive to prepare it, and they currently don't have the funds to do anything with that.
It's years to build out. You've been working on it for 18 years. Is this profitable or is this strictly environmental investment?
It was both. So it took us 12 years to get the permits. It took us 2 years to finance the improvements when every bank said no, and to build out the improvements we needed to take our first sediment in December 2003. For the first 10 years, we just paid back debt and paid employees, and we didn't make any profit. And I am very thankful I had other employment, so I was able to not take any money. For the last 10 years, we've been profitable. And, we had to take on private investors when the bank said no, and to help us build out this project. We have to be profitable at some point in order to make this work. But because we own the most efficient sediment offloading equipment in the region, and because we're situated on a deep water channel, we're efficient enough so we can be profitable. There are other projects that people are thinking about or have tried that don't have those attributes, and it's harder for them to make a profit, harder for them to be efficient.
Is the profit coming from people pay you to take the sediment or
Yes, that's our sole source of revenue is we charge a tipping fee to take the sediment. The oil refineries that are up and down the northern Contra Costa and southern Solano County coastlines, all of them have been sending us sediment for 15, 18 years. And so, in a way, those oil companies have participated in some very significant ecological restoration by doing that.
and
As has the federal government, the Corps of Engineers has sent us a lot of sediment. Port of San Francisco, the Port of Oakland, they've all sent us a significant amount of sediment over time. And we're also the most reliable alternative, even more reliable than the ocean disposal site, because in bad weather, the ocean site is tough.
right.
Uh, our site, we're available 365, 24/7.
And what was your capacity? I think you might have said that earlier, but what's the capacity there for how many more years can you continue to take sediment at that rate?
So, yeah, we've taken about 12 million yards so far, and I believe we have another 15 million yards left. So we'll be around for 15 to 20 years, depending on the rate which folks send it to us. And the result of that next 10 years of sediment is going to be the restoration of another 950 acres of what we believe will be the most valuable tidal wetland in the region. I'm past Medicare age, and a lot of my friends are not working anymore, but this really gets me up in the morning as well as the other projects I work on. And so, God willing, I'll be here for a while doing this.
It's amazing what you're accomplishing and how you found the balance. There's a lot of argument out there, right? If you invest in the environment and clean energy, it just costs companies money, but you're showing a business model that is profitable off of restoring the environment and helping out other areas at the same time.
I just go back to my time at the state of California. I had to find solutions where nobody had a clue. Aside from the Montezuma Wetlands Project, we've identified a lot of other alternatives where you can make money and improve the environment. Given the state of California's budget crisis, which may never get a lot better, I don't know. And, given the amount of debt that the national government has, I think it's absolutely critical that we find ways where private enterprise and public sector can work together to achieve these goals. And what we've built is a series of companies now that, with private initiative and private capital and streamlined decision making, because that's really also what a private partnership can bring. We're able to accelerate and achieve environmental goals and make money at the same time. Government agencies can't do the things that we do, even when they're funded, because when we start our projects, including this project, there's no guarantee that it was going to work. There's no guarantee. We had to buy this high rate offloader before we had permits. So what agency would allow their purchasing people to do that? This was a one-time available purchase. It was at an auction. And if you didn't buy it then, you were never going to have it. And so we were able to do things and move quickly. We sometimes make decisions in one day or an hour to do something that is timely and necessary. Whereas as a government agency, it might take months to go up through the chain. And if there's any element of risk, that maybe it won't work right, or maybe it will cost more, they'll typically hold it up or say no. And that's how private enterprise, particularly the enlightened private enterprise that we have in the current day, that private enterprise can play a very important role in addressing these environmental problems that have been festering for 2 centuries.
Just had Seamus Murphy from SF Bay Area Ferry. I interviewed him, and he was talking one of the biggest issues in reaching additional areas, particularly in East Contra Costa through the Cardenas Straits and other parts of Solano County is that you do have to dredge and you can't get deep enough for the ferry to move fast enough. Any thoughts on that and how we might be able to improve that system and get more boats to other places?
Having an available dredge sediment reuse site like ours is really solves the biggest obstacle to dredging. Yes, there are fish windows where you cannot dredge, but that's not the whole year. And so for any of those locations that may be helpful for future water transport, it's quite feasible. And I would say nearly certain that you can get dredging permits, including annual maintenance permits, because you dredge it to the required depth and then the winter storms bring in more sediment and deposit there. So you have to keep dredging every year or two. But our site is available and we have capacity. And I think if that really was the plan for the ferry system, then there are options to deal with that are quite available. And particularly as you get up in Contra Costa, Solano County, which is so close to our site, the costs from there are quite reasonable because the transport costs are so low.
You're closer.
Yeah.
Well, I think the biggest obstacle to that is not the engineering feat per se, the who's gonna pay for that, right? Who pays for the dredging and
Right. So, there's probably got to be some conjunctive land use at those locations that really benefit from having people come in and out, whether that's tourism or entertainment or housing. But as you know, in the Bay and in the Delta, there are existing policies that really cut against redeveloping those areas, even tastefully and sparingly, for tourism and housing near the shoreline. It's very hard to do. And so I think some of those issues have to be fixed if we're going to find enough economic use to pay for the kind of dredging and ferry transport that Seamus is talking about.
that's an interesting perspective, but it ties into economic growth, which is a big theme of the podcast is how does the region keep growing? From gonna come back to a nature standpoint, can people visit the wetlands and sort of walk around and take pictures of birds and stuff? Or is it private, working area only?
It's private now. We do have a BCDC permit that I believe in 2 or 3 years requires us to install a trail system to allow people to visit. At the same time, we have hosted probably a group every month of folks who have asked to come visit the site, and we lead tours even into our operating areas so they can see the industrial and mechanical processes we use to move sediment so rapidly. It's quite an interesting tour. So I would say to your listeners, if they were to visit our MontezumaWetlands.com website, they can send us a message. And, if they have a small group that wants to take a tour, we can find a way to accommodate them. Very interestingly, when we were giving a tour about a month ago to environmental engineering class from UC Berkeley, I was waiting out front for a few carloads of people to arrive. And a car slowed up, and I went over to ask them if they're here for the tour. And it turned out to be Joe's cousin, who was raised in Collinsville. They both, Joe DiMaggio and his cousin, were raised in Collinsville. And this was the first time he'd been back to this area in 50 years. And so he went on the tour with us when we were doing it. But we really like doing tours. I've gotten so much amazing feedback from people who've seen what we've done, not just to understand what we did, but to grasp the idea that sometimes dreams that people say are impossible can be done. And what it takes to do that, it's not just the technical knowledge, it's a whole range of things that you have to put together. But things that people say are impossible often are not. They just haven't been done yet. In fact, that's what's going to be necessary with the huge deficit we have in the environmental infrastructure the huge impacts we've had over the last 150 years, we're going to have to do some impossible things. And I believe that we can do them, but we're going to have to be willing to take a minute amounts of risk in order to get something done right now. And I think our culture, particularly here in the Bay Area, does not do that. Nobody wants to take a little bit of a risk. And we see this all the time. And there's a culture of particularly among some of the big environmental groups. Some of them opposed our project initially and then later apologized. But there's a predisposition to oppose projects. They're okay with policies, but in the end, the policies are just, paper in a binder up on the bookshelf. The birds and the bees and the wildlife, they don't know about any of that. All they know is what actually gets into the ground. And putting solutions in the ground are projects. And there's a lot of inherent opposition to projects, particularly those that are led by private enterprise. And I understand how that developed. 50 years ago, private enterprise with all their projects of mines and factories and everything else, they didn't really give two hoots about the environment for the most part. And I can see how a whole culture developed among environmentalists. The first step is to stop it because most things were bad. But we have a whole new generation of capitalists and companies nowadays who have embodied these environmental values. And we, people like myself, want to make the world better. We have the resources and the abilities to actually do some of that. And most of the people like me don't want to suffer the frustrations and the insult and the opposition to do something that's going to end up being great. That's just part of what happens if you go down the path I went down. I'm not the most sensitive person in the world, and I've gotten used to weathering all that. But there are a lot more people who could do what I do if there wasn't this culture of opposition.
I think that's an interesting challenge out there for the audience is the Bay Area is inventing AI. We are leading the way in autonomous vehicles and biotech engineering and life sciences. Let's be innovative. Let's take risks and let's improve our environment. And by the way, if you didn't hear, why did we talk about how what is Jim's business model for Montezuma Wetland? It's because you could do this with private capital and be profitable on a project that can help with the environment and connecting all of that. I really love it. I have 3 young daughters and I ask, what is people's advice to them? And this is dream, right? Ask yourself the question to, hey, how do I fix this? Right? And that's what you did. That's great.
Yeah, we dreamed, we prepared ourselves through our educational training and our early professional work, and then we just took it on. And we ran into obstacles we could never have anticipated. We changed the federal law 2 times in Congress, and I never thought you could ever change the law, but we did it. And we tackled all kinds of challenges to make this happen. But there's a culture of opposition. And I'll give you an example of it that is so ironic. We've also come up with a plan to sequester 6 to 9 million tons a year of carbon dioxide in deep geologic formations beneath the Montezuma site. We just happen to sit on top of the best formations in the region for doing that. And yet there are environmental groups who bellyache all the time about climate change. And their initial response is, well, there's a risk it could leak out of the pipeline, which really never happens. And the amounts would be minute, you shut it off. They're willing to let all that go into the atmosphere every single day. It's because they're scared of a 0.5% leaking occasionally, maybe, which it wouldn't happen.
Changed environmental group, the biggest opposition to the solar industry. Right?
I think we just need to all be on the same page, and we all need to pull together, And we all need to have the conversation that the risks of doing nothing are still great. They're not even risks, they're actually happening today. And if we want our grandchildren to see the glaciers and the polar bears, we better act today. We need to fast track projects. We can't do the slow walk. We can't have lawsuits that take 2 years to sort out just differences of philosophy. The facts are right here. That's the challenge. And that's where America can lead the world and or where America could fail the world.
Love it, and I will end by challenging anybody who's listening, if they wanna take a tour, I'll arrange a field trip up there. I love field trips to get away from my office. Contact me. We'll work with East Bay leadership, a couple of the chambers, the Bay Area Council, and maybe get a group up there. So just let me know who's interested, and we'll have a fun afternoon.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. Your podcasts are amazing. I've listened to a few of them, and it's an honor to be part of that.
Thanks, Jim Levine from the Montezuma Wetlands. Wait, don't leave yet. Hit subscribe. Make sure you get the weekly updates. We have a new episode every Wednesday for stuff happening in the East Bay. In the meantime, follow me on LinkedIn, Jared Asch, or check out our firm where we have a weekly newsletter and blog at Capstone Government Affairs on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us today on the Capstone Conversation.